Valiant Smashers introduces 3 new decks to the metagame, and I thought now would be a perfect time to talk about those decks, as well as some of the other decks that I missed in my first tier list, which if you haven't checked out already, be sure to do so. It's already up on my channel. This tier list is going to focus more on the quote-unquote rogue decks, or the lesser known decks of the format, but which I still think are worth talking about. So with all that being said, let's hop straight into the video. So the first deck I'm going to talk about is Resonator. So I think that Resonator as a deck is quite solid. They have some pretty good combos that can do a lot, and the deck seems fairly consistent so far. The only gripe I would say I really have about it is folds very heavily to a hand trap like Nibiru. And since Nibiru is quite popular in this format, I think that can be a big problem for a deck like this, which doesn't necessarily have an in-engine way to stop it, or set up a way to play around Nibiru necessarily with the regular combo. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible to play around the card, but I will say that since it does have that big glaring problem, I'm just going to put it in the high potential tier for right now. And just to clarify, when I say high potential, I mean this tier as in decks that are pretty solid, but either have a certain weakness that needs to be addressed first, or it's a deck that is likely going to be good in the future and just needs a good pilot or some innovation to make it good. So Resonator, I think, falls in that boat. The cards themselves are quite solid, and I think that Resonator, if someone is able to find out a nice combo with it, or some engines to mix with it to protect it from cards like the Nibiru, it can be incredibly strong. Next up is Scareclaw, and I mean pure Scareclaw. I actually like this deck a lot because you have a lot of consistency, and all your starters essentially become extenders as well. Now granted, the actual ceiling of this deck isn't necessarily that high, which is why you'll see cards like Fenrir and the Adventure Engine be played normally, but I would say that as a deck, this is also a very high potential deck. I think what's holding it back is that it doesn't necessarily do enough. Like going first, sure, you can set up a Griffin plus like your Triheart and maybe like one of the Scarecrow traps at most, but unless your opponent's deck is requiring like link monsters, like cards like Scarecrow Twinsaw just aren't going to get the max potential out of them. And if you don't see cards like Fenrir and cards like the Adventure Engine, then your end board is just very mid. Yes, it's very consistent, and you're probably not going to brick with it, and it does have OTKs going second. I just feel like the ceiling of the deck isn't necessarily high enough to push it into the competitive tier, in my opinion. Next up is Dinomorphia. So Dinomorphia has actually seen a little bit of success even at a YCS. It did get top 32 at Indianapolis, I believe, or one of the most recent YCSs. And I think as a deck that it's a very strong stun deck. Like the monsters and summons are incredibly obnoxious and difficult to deal with. And even if your opponent is super low on life points, it's going to be very hard to kill them because of their cards that protect them. The biggest problem this deck has is, unfortunately, the time rules. The win condition of this deck essentially requires it to go very low in life, and it is more of a control style deck, so it does need to play longer games, meaning that you're going to go into time more often than not with this deck most likely, and that's just something that can be exploited, unfortunately. So I'm gonna have to put this also in the high potential tier. I would normally put it in like mid or lower because I feel like as a stun deck there are just better ones out there like Labyrinth, but I want to give it some credit because it did have that success at YCS recently, so the cards are actually better than I might be giving them credit for. Next up is Earth Machine. So Earth Machine Toolbox is a pretty interesting deck. They can adapt it to do a lot of different things. I've seen combos with Paradise Smasher to essentially VFD your opponent, or you could just be playing like a very control-based variant with cards like Skill Drain or Floodgates, for example. So I think the flexibility of the deck makes it quite nice, and it's also somewhat resilient to most hand traps aside from Droll and Lockbird. And I think that while it does have that weakness, it's still a very high potential deck. There are lots of one-card combos and lots of different variations the combos can go down. You can play different builds with the Vernisils, with like Floodgates, hand traps, stuff like that. And I think that flexibility just makes it so Earth Machine as a rogue deck is a pretty solid high potential deck. Next up is Ninjas. So Ninjas was seeing some play a few formats ago, back when Kashtira was a thing, because of their prevalence of flipping opponents' monsters face down, which is just super strong against a deck like Kashtira. But I think, unfortunately, in today's day and age, specifically this Valiant Smashers format, it's really not going to do that much. Like, yes, the Book of Moon effects are still nice, but one problem this deck had with going second, and that was sort of mitigated by the fact that, oh, even going second against a deck like Kashtira, your traps can still be good. You can still flip their monsters face down and control the game from there. But now I think that it's just not going to be able to do that, and for that reason, I think I'm going to have to put ninjas in only for fun. I don't think this is a very great deck. It does have its fair share of inherent issues. It can be quite slow at times, and while it does have the potential to play certain floodgates, I just feel like there are just better stun decks out there that can do what it needs to do better. Next up is Altergeist. Altergeist is interesting because when new support just came out, people were trying it, and I personally feel that the new support does raise its ceiling a lot, gives it a lot of potential turn 1 to actually set up a somewhat scary board, but I think then it starts opening itself up to cards like Nibiru, which just it shouldn't be losing to. And like I mentioned with ninjas, I think as a stun deck, they're just better ones that can manage their resources better, like Labyrinth out there. I'm gonna have to put Altergeist in the mid tier. I think it's an okay rogue deck. It can probably get wins here or there, but I just feel like it doesn't have as much potential as some of the other decks I talk about in here. Next up is Drytron. So Drytron is in an interesting place right now. I think that Drytron as a deck is still very scary. It's sort of like a better have droll type of deck. Otherwise, you're probably going to lose, be it to the Drake Overlord skipping your turn, or Magician of Black Chaos making it so you can't use monster effects, or even just setting up a really big board. I think that Drytron is pretty scary because one, their combos can just do a lot and has the flexibility to end on a lot of different things. So sort of like these other decks in the high potential tier, it's held back by like 1 or 2 things, and right now I think that's Droll and Lockbird plus like the prevalence of Bystials, for example, and DD Crow. That can make it so Drytrons can struggle a little bit. Plus Shifter is still a pretty prevalent card, so unfortunately I think that these are what's holding Drytron back, but in the right format, when those cards sort of fall out a little bit, I think Drytron can once again rise to the top. Next up is Tri-Brigade. So Tri-Brigade, I'm talking about decks like Tri-Brigade Sprite, like Tri-Brigade Horus, I think I've seen before too. It's an interesting choice because Tri-Brigade as a deck, historically, I think has always been pretty fair. It doesn't necessarily do anything super unfairly, but once you combine it with those other engines, you start being able to take advantage of the best of like the Tri-Brigade engine. You get a lot of graveyard effects, for example, that pair well with the Horus monsters. You have a lot of level 2s that go well with sprites. And I think that, once again, like these other decks in the high potential tier, it has a lot of potential. Like, I think the cards themselves are still good enough to be played. Revolt is still a pretty insane card because it gets you follow-up plus a banish on the field. Pretty solid. Plus, when you mix it with those other engines, you're raising its ceiling by quite a lot. I just think that the one thing holding it back is maybe it's like consistency and power level still. It's just a little bit lower than some of the other meta decks out there. Next up is Synchron Adventure. So this was a thing quite a while ago. Where people would be playing just the adventure cards, a bunch of hand traps, and some synchron monsters, trying to resolve Junk Speeder and sort of just hand loop your opponent a bunch of times, or go for the Crimson Dragon into the Calamities. And I think that it's still a pretty solid choice. However, I do feel that in terms of combo decks that do that, there are just better ones out there, even on this tier list itself. Like, I think I'm gonna have to put it in the mid tier. Yes, the deck can still do quite a lot, but I feel like it's pretty vulnerable to hand traps, and in terms of a solid backbone engine, it actually doesn't have that. Like, you are playing a bunch of random synchron monsters and some tuners and the adventure engine, but compared to the actual engine of some of these other combo decks, it just doesn't do as much when you get disrupted on a card like Junk Speeder, for example. Like, your deck struggles to push past a negation on Junk Speeder, plus with the prevalence of cards like Infinite Impermanence and Effect Filler now in this format, I think that Junk Speeder is resolving less and less often, making it so this deck just isn't that great. Next up is Kashtira, and this is the first deck I think that actually can compete consistently with the meta decks in the format. Kashtira is still pretty solid at just making a big board from very little. It has the options to play powerful tech cards like Dimension Shifter, and doesn't really lose to cards like Droll or Nibiru necessarily. So I think that Kashtira, in terms of a rogue deck, has a lot of competitive potential, and you'll definitely see it succeeding in even big events like the YCS like it already has. Next up is Gold Pride Punk. Gold Pride Punk, I think, similar to these other combo decks like I mentioned in terms of the Synchron deck, I just feel like it's very mid. Like, you're losing to a couple of the hand traps out there, and it just doesn't really have as high of a ceiling even as a deck like Synchron. Like, the boards it puts up, like, you can probably play through it with quite a few of the meta decks out there, so it doesn't do anything particularly unfairly as well. Plus, it has the problem that Dynamorphia has in the sense that it needs to pay life points to achieve its win condition, meaning you're just gonna end up losing net games to time, since that's something that can be exploited, unfortunately. Next up is Dinos. So Dinos has always been a decent rogue deck in pretty much every format it's been out for. I feel that Dinos have the option to go first or go second. You can play quite a few hand traps in your deck. You can put a lot of board breakers. The cards inherently are pretty solid going second, like Lost World. Or you could switch to going first build and sort of make it like a combo deck that's able to go second as well. You can put in a few scrap cards, for example, and you're able to set up a pretty big combo board of cards like Savage, Baron, for example. And I think that for that reason, I'm going to put it in the high potential here. I still feel that Dinos does also suffer from a consistency problem as well, which is ultimately what's holding it back in the end too. Next up is Hero. It can go first, set up cards like Darklaw and DPE. It can OTK you out of nowhere, but at the same time, it does have those problems like some of these other rogue decks does. It has no good way to play around Nibiru or Droll Lockbird, especially because you have so many cards that lock you into the hero engine itself, which I haven't even mentioned at this point, but the fact that is like this deck can't even make a card like SP Little Knight, which is one of just the best monsters in the game in the moment right now. And the fact that you're sort of tunneled and locked into heroes, I think sort of what's holding this deck back. Yeah, I understand going first it can be incredibly strong, so Darklaw is still a very oppressive card. It can auto-win against some decks out there, but I just feel like in terms of a competitive deck, it's probably not enough to really push it that far up. Plus, with the prevalence of cards like Bystials and DD Crow still, like cards like DPE just aren't doing as much as they used to. And I think for that reason, I'll probably have to put it at like the top of the mid tier, maybe bottom of high potential. I don't really feel like this deck is terrible, but I don't think it's great either. Next up for the first new deck from Valiant Smashers, that's going to be Centurion. So I will say that I have never personally tested these decks. I've only seen what they can do a bit online. But in terms of competitive viability, I feel like Centurion is going to be competitively viable right out the gate. They have all those very consistent one-card combos. And while the deck doesn't necessarily have the highest ceiling out there, like, yeah, all of their combo storages lead to like a Calamity Lock that's unprotected, which granted is not bad. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to expect to be hand-trapped or hit with some board breakers as well. The thing that's sort of pushing it into competitive tier for me at least is the fact that it's very consistent. People aren't really going to know what it's going to do, so they may side improperly, play improperly against it, and it has that advantage right now of being a new deck. So speaking of the other new decks, I'm just talk about them right now alongside with the Centurions. Valmonica and Mementos, I believe they're called, are decks that have high potential. Like right now, I don't think they're going to be doing anything at all, but with these deck building sets, you do expect to see more support in the future. And I think that reading these initial waves of cards themselves, like there are actually a few solid ones in each of these archetypes. And I think that with the right support, they can absolutely be a very competitive deck in the future. Now, that being said, like I mentioned, it's not going to do anything right now, probably, unless someone proves me wrong and comes up with something crazy. But I would say that for the future, these are decks you should probably keep your eye on. And for now, you should probably only really worry about having to play against a Centurion. Next up is Virtual World, so one of my favorite decks. But objectively, in terms of rogue deck, I'll probably have to put this in the mid tier. It pains me to do it, but Virtual World as a deck just feels like it's sort of been left behind with the times. Like, yeah, it's still just as powerful as it was back in the day, but now that ceiling is a lot lower compared to some of the other meta decks out there. And in terms of a mid-range deck, it just feels like there's better mid-range control strategies out there that can do a lot more with like single cards, for example, because Virtual World does require you to have multiple cards in your hand to play all the time. You can't really afford to play that many hand traps because you want to be seeing combinations of engine cards. And I think, unfortunately, that's what's holding it back. Plus, with a card like Shen Shen, while it's still okay against some decks, it's not necessarily the end-all be-all against certain decks out there as a floodgate. And boards like Shen Shen, Crystal, and Chuche, while they may have been good back in the day, probably are not going to cut it that well right now. Plus, it has a similar problem as Heroes. It can't play SP Little Knight, which is, I think, personally, a pretty big problem for some of these decks because SP Little Knights can single-handedly just win games, and losing an option to an auto-win button, I think, is just really bad. Next up is Plunder Patrol. I think that Plunder Patrol is in a similar boat as a Virtual World, except it does have a little bit more potential because of its splashability with other engines out there. There are engines like Chimera you can put into it, Runic you can put into it. I've even heard of like Labyrinth Plane Patrol because they're fiends. I would say that in terms of deck, it has a lot of potential. Once you combine it with powerful engines like Adventure or Runic, it significantly raises the ceiling of this deck a lot. But I still feel that as a deck, it isn't necessarily as good as some of these other competitive rogue decks in my opinion, but I will just put in the high potential tier for now just because of its flexibility. Next up is Cyber Dragon. I think I'm gonna have to put this in only for fun. Your deck benefits very much from going second and doesn't really do that much going first like Cyber Dragon does. I feel that it's a problem in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Because then you're relying on your engine breaking through boards, and with the variety of different meta decks in the format right now, your board breakers and engine aren't going to be able to cover all your bases. And I think that unless Cyber Dragons finds a very good way of going first in addition to going second, I feel that it's probably just going to be a for fun deck, at least for now. Next up is Sky Striker. I think that Sky Striker is a pretty mid-tier pick. I wouldn't say it's a terrible choice, but I just feel that the ceiling Striker has is quite low unless your hands are like perfect with a bunch of spells and engage. But on average, I'll say that the ceiling of a Striker deck is quite low, and as a control deck, it heavily relies more on floodgates, whereas a deck like Labyrinth can actually control the game with just their engine themselves, whereas Sky Striker will most likely struggle to do so unless they're already set up. So for that reason, I'm going to put in the mid-tier. Still probably an okay deck, but I wouldn't really think it's super competitive at the moment. Next up is Mekanko, and I know I'm going to get comments already like, oh, tcgsam, why is Mekanko in the Rogue tier list? It's topped many events, it's a good deck, and yes, I'm aware of that. The only reason I'm putting it here is because I didn't have it in my Age of Overlord tier list. It's certainly a competitive strategy right now. Nowadays, it actually has a legitimate win condition when going first. It's giving you Acid Golem, that's a pretty nasty combo, and you're able to play blowouts like Ken and Jen, Callens, Thrust, and it's just super insane when this deck goes first. I will say that it does have some problems into cards like Droll, but aside from that, it's a pretty solid competitive meta deck. Next up is Phantom Knight, Horus. I do think this is a competitive deck as well. The Horus cards are incredibly strong, and Phantom Knights, while they were released a few years ago, are still decent in terms of what they can do. The Horus cards add a lot of consistency to the Phantom Knights deck because now you have Discard Atlas to get into the graveyard, you have rank 8s like Zombie Vampire, or the Galaxy Eyes Photon Lord you can make to protect your combos from going through. It has a lot of splashability with other engines as well, not just the Horus engine, you could probably play Dangers in it as well. I will mention though, it does unfortunately have a weakness to Shifter. However, I think it does fare a little bit better into cards like Nibiru and Drone Lockbird than some of these other meta decks. But nonetheless, I think it's a very powerful meta contender and has a lot of potential. Finally, we have Trap Tricks. I don't think this deck is great. It's a pretty mid deck in my opinion. I feel like it was only really ever good as a rogue deck back in the day because of a deck like Ashtira. It had a pretty good matchup against that. Going second, this deck has historically always struggled as well, so I feel that since the deck doesn't do anything super unfairly and does have problems when going second, it's probably just a mid-tier deck for me. So that's gonna do it for this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. If you agree, disagree, I can't possibly cover every single deck that could ever be relevant, so do bear with me in terms of that. But with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.